Welcome to Planning for Retirement with Scott Nelson. Plan well, retire happy.
All right, so if I could have your attention, everybody, we're going to attempt to get started. I will point out to you that in these folders, you have a little booklet. In the back of said booklet are some lined pages where you can take notes. I know the first time I heard David, I took a bunch. So I first met David McKnight 10 years ago at a symposium for financial advisors down in Phoenix, where he was one of the presenters. And to say I was impressed is a huge understatement. What I appreciate most about David is that he takes a very balanced, almost scholarly, maybe it is exactly what I should say, scholarly approach to his advice and approach to financial planning. After his presentation, I purchased the book, The Power of Zero, read it, and started implementing the concepts there as best as I could figure out in my practice. During COVID or just after, I learned that David was partnering with financial advisors across the country, and I threw my hat in the ring and flew back to Chicago and met with David and his team, and I'm pleased to say they accepted me. And that's been a huge differentiator for us in our practice. Probably one of the best things I've done professionally is to partner with David McKnight. At another symposium this spring, we were there together, and David mentioned that he was going to be in Utah this week doing a presentation to a professional gathering in Salt Lake, and asked if I'd be interested in having him speak here for our group. And I told him yes immediately, if only for the chance to listen to him again myself. So I'm going to now show a short introductory video about David. So if I could turn your attention to the screen.
David McKnight graduated from Brigham Young University with honors in 1997. Over the past 23 years, David has helped put thousands of Americans on the road to the 0% tax bracket. He has made frequent appearances in Forbes, USA Today, New York Times, Fox Business, CBS Radio, Bloomberg Radio, Huffington Post, Reuters, CNBC, Yahoo Finance, NASDAQ.com, Investors Business Daily, Kiplinger's, MarketWatch, and numerous other national publications. His best-selling book, The Power of Zero, has sold over 350,000 copies, and the updated and revised version was published by Penguin Random House. When it was launched in September of 2018, it finished the week as the #2 most sold business book in the world. For 2 consecutive years, Forbes magazine has ranked The Power of Zero as a top 10 financial resource in the country. This book was recently made into a full-length documentary film called The Power of Zero, The Tax Train is Coming. When his follow-up book, Tax-Free Income for Life, launched in November of 2020, it finished the week as the #3 top-selling business book in the world. He and his wife Felice have 7 children. Please give a warm welcome to David McKnight.
Thank you very much. I assume that applause is for my wife and not for me. Ask a lot of questions. If you feel like you know the answer, just yell it out. You don't even need to raise your hand. So we're going to start off with a quiz. First question on the quiz is simply this. Can anybody tell me the highest tax bracket in the history of our country? What's the worst it's ever been? 97. You're slightly over. Let's split the difference here. It was 94. Last 2 years of World War II, the highest marginal tax bracket was 94%. And that was for any dollar you made above and beyond $200,000. Now, $200,000 back then was a pretty big deal. It was about $3.2 million in today's dollars. Can you even think of anybody back then that made that type of money? Maybe the Rockefellers, right? Well, there was an actor who later became a politician. Can you think of who that was? Why is this not advancing? There it is, Ronald Reagan. When you study Ronald Reagan's biography, he talks about how he never made more than 2 movies in a year. Reason being, he made about $100,000 per movie, and any dollar he made above and beyond $200,000, he only kept 6 cents on the dollar. But truth be told, he didn't even get to keep the 6 cents. Who do you think got the 6 cents? The state of California to pay for state tax. So it literally did not make sense for Ronald Reagan to work past the month of June, so he would take the rest of the year off. He'd go to his ranch, he'd ride horses, he'd start making movies again January 1st the following year. So that was a long time ago. Let's fast forward to the decade of the 70s. Can anybody tell me the highest marginal tax bracket you could pay throughout the entire decade of the 70s? This one's easy to remember. Throughout the entire decade of the 70s, worst federal marginal tax bracket you could pay was 70%. Once again, for any dollar you made above and beyond $200,000. Now let's fast forward to today. Today, 2024. Who can tell me the highest marginal tax bracket you can pay today, the tax rate at which Bill Gates pays taxes on most of his earned income? It's 37. So here's my question for you, and this is not a trick question. How does 37 stack up against some of these tax rates we experienced in the past? What do you think? It's pretty good, and it's interesting you should say that because I do this workshop all across the country. I routinely ask rooms full of people, hey, how bad are taxes today? What do you think they say? Terrible, horrible, as bad as they've ever been. What's the truth? The truth is the tax rates today are just about as low as we've seen in our lifetime. However, something is going to happen to that tax bracket January 1st, 2026. Is it going to go up or is it going to go down? It's going to go up. What's it going to go up to? Very close. It's going to go up to 39.6. And guess what, folks? In order for that to happen, all Congress has to do is nothing. Is Congress pretty good at doing nothing? Yes. Well, is 39.6 enough to keep me awake at night? Well, 39.6 is what tax rates were throughout the entire decade of the 90s. Does anybody remember how the stock market was doing in the 90s? Was it doing okay? Yeah, it was doing great. In fact, if you dropped $100,000 into the S&P 500 in 1990, took a nap for 9 years, woke up in 1999, anybody want to take a stab at what that $100,000 been worth? You woke up in 99 before it took a tumble. $600,000. Your money would have sextupled during the decade of the 90s alone, and that's under these types of tax rates. So again, not enough to keep me awake at night. The real question I have for you, however, is this. What is likely to happen to tax rates beyond 2026 as we move forward in time to 2028, 2030, and beyond? What does your gut tell you? Are tax rates down the road likely to be higher or lower than 39.6? Raise your hand if you think higher. That's most of the people in the room, so I think I'm with you. So for those of you in the room that think that tax rates down the road are likely to be higher than 39.6, my question for you is why? What will we be spending money on as a country that could literally force tax rates to go up? What are the big ticket items? Just yell them out. You got to be more specific. Debt. Okay? What's driving the debt up, though? But what are we spending the money on? Social Security. Medicare. I don't know why this is not advancing like I want it to. Okay, Medicaid. Social Security. By the way, how much debt do we owe? Yeah, we just hit 35. That's a 3 and a 5 followed by 12 zeros. We owe some of that to ourselves. We borrowed some of it from Social Security, but who else do we owe a lot of that money to? China. I don't know if you guys realize, but just recently the U.S. Treasury came out with a new $100 bill. Did you guys see that? I think it's because China's got all the old ones. Sort of a tough crowd tonight, huh? Okay, so we got Medicare. What's driving it up? It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. The CARES Act. Does anybody remember what the CARES Act was for? That was for COVID. Did you guys know COVID blew a massive hole in our economy? We had to build a bridge to span that abyss in our economy. That bridge cost $6 trillion. We borrow more in 1 year than we had the previous 6 years combined. Here's an interesting one right here, pensions. The other day I was talking to a lady. I said, hey, what happens to your pension if your company goes broke? She says, don't worry. No matter what happens to my company, the federal government guarantees I will always receive 2/3 of my pension every year till I die. Folks, that's what we call an unfunded obligation. What's an unfunded obligation? It's a promise the federal government's made that they can't afford to keep. Some experts say that what the federal government's promised that it can't afford to pay is about $125 trillion. But there's a very famous economist by the name of Dr. Larry Kotlikoff out of Boston University, foremost expert in the world on what we call fiscal gap accounting. And what he does is he projects out over the next 75 years everything that we promised to pay for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt. And then he projects out over that same time frame what we can actually afford to deliver under today's tax rates. He says, guess what? If there's a difference between those two numbers, then your country has a fiscal gap. And that's its true national debt. He says the real national debt's not $35 trillion. It's not even $125 trillion. He says it's much closer to $239 trillion. What does that mean? That means that we would have to have $239 trillion sitting in a bank account today earning treasury rates to be able to deliver on everything that we promised that we can't afford to pay. And the list goes on and on and on. But if you had to pick two things on this list that will make debt go up more than any two other things, which two would you pick? Social Security is one of them. And Medicare. Let's see if we can sort of wrap our brains around why. I'm going to open up a brief parenthesis just on Social Security alone. Can anybody tell me when Social Security was invented? When did they first roll out Social Security? What year? Yeah, it's 1935, linchpin of the New Deal, hallmark of the Roosevelt administration. And when Social Security first started out, how many workers were putting money into the program for every one person that took money out? What did that ratio look like? 12 to 1? Try 42 to 1. You had 42 workers putting money in for every one person that took money out. And back then, how old did you have to be to draw on Social Security? 65. Anybody want to take a stab at what the average life expectancy was back then? It was 62. They didn't even anticipate that the average person would live long enough to ever draw on Social Security. And if you were lucky enough to make it to 65, how long did you draw on Social Security before you tipped over dead? Only a couple of years. So in summary, when Social Security first started out, you had all these people putting money in, hardly anybody taking money out. And when they took it out for 2 years, then they died. Was Social Security pretty solvent when it first started out? You bet it was. It was set up to last forever. And then something happened. Soldiers came home from World War II and they started to do something at a rate at which they'd never done it before. What did they start doing? Having babies. Thank you for the tasteful way in which you put that. They started to have children. In fact, if you look at demographic trends over the last 100 years or so, they look a little bit like this. You start off at the turn of the century with what we call the Henry Ford generation. These are our World War II vets. What did Tom Brokaw call these folks? The greatest generation. And they were followed up by what we call the silent generation, still sort of reeling from the Great Depression. And then what do we call this statistical anomaly right here? These are our baby boomers. So as it turns out, my mom was one of the very first baby boomers. She was born January 17th, 1946. And when was the last baby boomer born? 1964. So we had 18 years of unprecedented procreation. How many baby boomers do we have in our country today? A lot. Thank you for being so precise. It's about 78 million, single largest voting bloc in the country. You'll see why that's important here in a second. Now, did baby boomers have a few children of their own? They had a few. Okay, what do we call these folks right here? Special? We call them Gen X. So I am a Generation Xer. And then we had children of our own. We call this Generation Y. I got 7 kids. That's exactly what I asked myself in the middle of the night. Now, as you look at this chart, did baby boomers, these folks in the middle, did they have nearly as many children as their parents did? Not even close. They had almost 30 million fewer children. So if you were to ask yourself today, how many workers are putting money into Social Security for every one person that takes money out, what does that ratio look like today? It's about 3 to 1. And in another 10 years, what's that going to look like? 2 to 1. And what's the earliest you can draw on Social Security today? What age? 62. And if you start at 62, how long will you continue to draw before you tip over dead? Try 23 years or until age 85. Folks, is Social Security today just a little bit different than when it first started out? You bet it is. It started off as insurance against living too long, and it slowly morphed into a pension program that covers us for nearly a quarter of our lives. Well, how many of you guys have heard of this guy right here, David Walker? Does that name ring a bell at all, David Walker? So David Walker was what we call the Comptroller General of the federal government. What does that mean? That means he was the head of the Government Accountability Office. He's on the board of Social Security. He was a nation's chief auditor. He was basically the CPA of the USA. And he did that for 10 years under Bush and Clinton. The reason I'm telling you this is because David Walker knows more about these numbers than just about anyone else on the planet. And he took one look at the books and he said, hey, you have promised way more than you can afford to deliver. He says, you think Social Security is bad. He says, Medicare is 5 times more expensive. He said, to be able to deliver on these 2 promises alone, he said this in 2008, he said, you would have to double taxes immediately. He said, you don't have to double taxes immediately, but for every year that you postpone doubling taxes, the national debt will grow by $2 trillion per year on average, each and every year, till we hit this magical moment in our country when we have $53 trillion of debt. Folks, what's wrong with a country that has $53 trillion of debt? Or is everything peachy keen? Did you know that if we had $53 trillion of debt, then most of the revenue at that point flowing into the U.S. Treasury under today's tax rates would only be enough to pay the interest on all that debt, let alone any principal, let alone a single dollar for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or anything else we listed on the screen. David Walker was so concerned about this that in 2008, he resigned. And he started to crisscross the country, raising the warning cry to whoever would listen. And in 2010, he wrote a book called Come Back America, in which he sort of diagnosed the problem. And he appeared on NPR to talk about the book. And he told the radio show hostess, he said, hey, look, tax rates have to double or we're going to go broke. And she didn't believe him. So he says, look, I'll give you one 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double. And she couldn't figure out what it was. So they opened up the phone lines and people started to call in. But nobody could figure out what the one 4-letter word was to explain why tax rates have to double. So I'm going to open it up to you guys. What do you guys think is a one 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double? Math. Math is the 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double. What did David Walker mean by math? Well, basically what he's saying, look, if this is what you're spending, but this is what's coming in, you either have to double what's coming in, cut in half what's going out, or some combination of the two. It's simple math. I remember I was given the same presentation 2 days before midterm elections in a little city called Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And I remember when I was done with my presentation, everyone came up to me and they said, Dave, who should we vote for? Who should we vote for? And I never felt so powerful. And I said, you know what? It doesn't matter who you vote for because whoever gets elected is going to inherit a math problem, the solution to which involves either doubling taxes, reducing spending by half, or some combination of the two. All right, let's get serious, folks. How many of you guys watch cartoons? I know Scott does. Okay, Tana does. How many of you guys have ever watched a cartoon? Okay. How many of you guys have ever seen The Roadrunner? Okay. Most of you were weaned on The Roadrunner, right? Well, who's always trying to kill the Roadrunner? Coyote, what's his name? Wile E. Coyote, super genius. Well, a couple of years ago, I was watching The Roadrunner. I was with my kids, and in this particular episode, the coyote was trying to kill the Roadrunner, and he was building a bomb with which to do so. And what company makes his bombs? Acme. Now we're cooking. All right, so he's building a bomb made by Acme inside a shed that was also made by Acme. And he was so focused and intent on finishing this bomb that he didn't realize that the Roadrunner had pushed his shed onto a train track. Maybe you've seen the episode. And he was so focused and intent on finishing this bomb that he also didn't realize until the last possible moment that there was a huge freight train bearing down on him. Now, very important question, most important question I'm going to ask tonight. If you found yourselves on a train track with a huge freight train bearing down on you, what would you do? You'd get out of the way. Well, let's go back to the Roadrunner. The Roadrunner sees this huge freight train bearing down on him, and instead of jumping out of the way, what does he do? He simply pulls down the window shade, thinking that the act of doing so would make the problem go away. Well, did the problem go away? No, there's a huge explosion, and does the coyote ever really die? No, it's frustrating, right? But as the smoke and fire cleared away, you can see him sort of limping off screen, very much the worse for wear. Well, why did we gather here tonight to talk about the Roadrunner? Well, as Americans who do most of our saving for retirement and what we call tax-deferred vehicles like 401ks and IRAs, we have a very real freight train that's bearing down on us, and it's bearing down on us in the form of what? Higher taxes, and we got a couple of choices of what we can do about it. We could pretend like the problem doesn't really exist. We could pretend like the math to which David Walker referred doesn't really add up. But isn't that a little bit like pulling down that window shade? Or we can implement some strategies starting right now that can help remove us from the train tracks, thereby insulating and buffering us from the impact of higher taxes. So what we're going to do in the balance of our time is we're going to talk about some strategies that you can start implementing right now to help get yourselves off the tracks. Now, as you know, there are millions of different types of investments out there. There's all sorts of different ways to save money for retirement, but I'm here to tell you that no matter where you save your retirement dollars, all of those investments basically fit into only 3 types of accounts. How's that for easy? There's only 3 basic types of accounts within which to save money for retirement, and today we're going to talk about these accounts in terms of buckets of money. The first bucket we're going to talk about is what we call the taxable bucket, meaning every year as your money grows, you get to pay a tax. Who can give me some examples other than these ones right here of some taxable investments? Savings account. 401k is going to be in the next bucket. This one is every year as your money grows, you get to pay a tax. So you got stocks, bonds, mutual funds. Now, how can you tell if you have a taxable investment? What's the tip-off? But how do you know you have to pay taxes? How do they tell you? I heard it. Every year, at the end of the year, the financial institution sends you that little love letter. It's called a 1099. It says, hey, your money grew this much. Now you got to give a portion of that money back to the IRS in the form of taxes. So the 1099 really is a tip-off. So generally speaking, the growth on the money in this bucket is 100% taxable. Well, if that's the case, why do we even have these types of investments? Well, we have them because generally speaking, they can be very liquid. What does liquid mean? Yeah, get your hands on it, convert it to cash, which means that they make for great emergency funds. What do financial experts tell us about how much money we should have in emergency funds? What have you heard? 6 months worth of basic living expenses, like the one number they could actually agree upon. Having said that, can you have too much money in this bucket? Yes, we see it all the time. We see the couple who lived through the Depression. They shuffle into my office. They say, Dave, we got 9 CDs for $100,000 each, sitting in 9 different banks, and we think we may be paying too much in tax. Are they paying too much in tax? Yes, because you can have too much money in this bucket. So what's the moral of the story when it comes to this bucket? You can have too much money from a tax efficiency perspective, but you can have not enough from an emergency fund perspective. So what we're looking for in this bucket is just the right amount. And just the right amount is 6 months worth of basic living expenses. Second bucket. Second bucket is what we call the tax-deferred bucket, meaning you don't pay taxes as your money grows. When do you pay the tax? At the very end, when you take the money out. Who can give me some examples of some common tax-deferred investments? IRA. What else? 401k. 403b, 457, SEPs, simples, annuities, you guys get the idea. Now, there's all sorts of different rules that apply to these different investments, but generally speaking, they all have 2 things in common. First thing they have in common, generally speaking, is when you put money in, you get a tax deduction. That's exactly right. So for example, if you make $100,000 per year and you put $10,000 into your 401k, what's your new adjusted gross income? $90,000, exactly right. And the second thing they have in common is the manner in which they're taxed upon distribution. Now, the IRS has a special word that they use to characterize this income when you take it out. What do they call this income when you take it out? Starts with an O. That's right, they call it ordinary income. Ordinary income. So what does that mean? That means that when you put money into that 401k, all you really did was defer the receipt of that income until some point much further down the road, and when you take the money out, at what rate are you taxed? Whatever the rate happens to be in the year you take that money out. So folks, isn't that a little bit like going into a business partnership with the IRS? And every year, they get to vote on what percentage of your profits they get to keep. Does that sound like a good business partnership to anyone? So you could have $1 million in your IRA, but unless you can accurately predict what tax rates are going to be in the year you take that money out, do you really know how much money you have? No, and it's pretty hard to plan for retirement if you don't know how much money you have. Well, let's talk about a third bucket. Third bucket has all sorts of different names. Some people call it tax advantage, some call it tax exempt, some call it tax preferred. Me, I like to call it tax free. Now, I got to warn you, there's all sorts of different investments out there that masquerade as tax free, but I'm here to tell you, to be truly tax free, it's got to qualify in two different ways. First way, it's got to really be tax free. And when I say tax-free, I'm talking free from three different types of taxes. Free from federal tax, free from state tax, and free from capital gains tax. How many of you guys have heard of municipal bonds? So like 4 of you, okay? Are municipal bonds free from federal tax? Why? I see my thing is jumping all over the place here. Are they free from federal tax? They actually are free from federal tax. Are they free from state tax? Not always. Let's say I live in Wisconsin and I buy a municipal bond from Illinois. Will the state of Wisconsin give me a tax break for that? No, because I'm not benefiting the municipality in which I live. And let's say I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket, and so I buy a mutual fund of municipal bonds. Then that mutual fund appreciates in value and I sell it at a gain. Will I pay capital gains tax on that mutual fund? Yes, I sure will. So an investment that we've been told for years and years and years is tax-free doesn't meet our first basic test. The second thing I'm looking for in a true tax-free investment is when you take money out, it should not count as provisional income. How many of you guys have heard of the phrase provisional income? If you haven't heard of provisional income, don't worry. I gave the same talk to 100 CPAs a couple years ago. How many of them do you think had ever heard of the phrase provisional income? Only 2. Only 2 of the 100 CPAs recognize the phrase provisional income, which is scary because what's provisional income? Provisional income is the income the IRS tracks to determine if they are going to tax your Social Security. What counts as provisional income? Well, any 1099s coming out of this bucket count as provisional income. Any distributions at all from this bucket count as provisional income. And 1/2 of your Social Security count as provisional income. So the IRS adds all this provisional income up. And if it's a single person, it adds up to more than $34,000. Or if it's a married couple, it adds up to more than $44,000. Then guess what? Up to 85% of your Social Security can become taxable to you at your highest marginal tax bracket. Let me put that into perspective for you. Let's say that because of your distributions from this bucket, you have a $5,000 hole in your Social Security. You got a $5,000 tax on your Social Security. How do you think most Americans go about paying that tax? By taking more money out of their IRAs and 401ks. So here's a math question for you. Let's say that what David Walker's predicting comes true and tax rates go up to 50%. By the way, he's predicting that'll happen by 2030. Let's say that that comes true, tax rates go up to 50%. How much money would you have to take out of your IRA to be able to pay that 50% tax to the IRS and then be left over with $5,000 with which you can then plug the hole in your Social Security? What's double 5,000? $10,000. Folks, why do I even bring this stuff up? I bring it up because I've done the math 100 times in 100 different ways on 100 different clients, and this is what I've concluded. I have concluded that when your Social Security gets taxed, you run out of money 5 to 7 years faster than people who do not have their Social Security taxed. Why? Because the act of compensating for Social Security taxation forces you to spend down all your other assets that much faster. By the way, when you take interest off your municipal bonds, does that count as provisional income? Yes, it sure does. So an investment that we've been told for years and years and years is double tax-free, triple tax-free, doesn't even meet either of our basic tests. Okay, everybody pretty much in a good mood by now? Okay, so what we're going to do in the balance of our time is I'm going to give you an example. Now, the one thing I can guarantee is that this example will not apply to any of you perfectly, but I can guarantee that there will be something in this example that applies to just about everybody in the room. So here's the example. We got Mr. and Mrs. Jones. They're 50 years old. They make $100,000 per year. They want to retire at age 65, and they're obviously very, very happy. Now remember, we've got those 3 buckets. What are the names of those 3 buckets again? Taxable, tax-deferred, and tax-free. Very good. Now, let's say Mr. and Mrs. Jones, they've got $500,000 in their IRAs sitting in their tax-deferred bucket. They got $100,000 in some plain old taxable mutual funds. That's their emergency fund over here. They're putting 10% into their 401k, but they're getting no company match. They're getting no free money. And they're paying $2,000 per year for some term life insurance, and they're paying $4,000 per year for some long-term care insurance. Now, if somebody like this, if a couple like this walked into a traditional tax-deferred paradigm financial advisor's office, how would the conversation go? Well, just so happens I've been training traditional tax-deferred financial advisors for the last 25 years of my life, and in the act of doing so, I have sat in their offices, and I've listened to them as they've spoken to people like this for the very first time. And here's how the conversation goes. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, congratulations. They always congratulate you. You've done a great job saving money in this IRA. Problem is, last year down the road, when you were at XYZ company, you only earned 7%. We think we can get you 8%. So roll all that money over to us. As far as your mutual funds go, that's a great emergency fund. Problem is, last year down the road, you only earned 3%. We think we can get you 5%. So let us manage that for you as well. As far as your 401k with no match goes, keep on doing it. When you switch jobs, give me a call. We'll roll the 401k into the IRA, get everything under one roof, maybe save you some break points, save you some fees. And as far as your term life insurance and long-term care insurance goes, gosh, you know, not really what we do, but who are we to say you shouldn't keep doing it? And that is a conversation that I've heard literally dozens and dozens of times. Well, when someone like this walks into my office for the very first time, I see red flags all over the place. For example, I'm not so much concerned with what's in this IRA today. What keeps me awake at night is what that IRA is going to be worth 15 years from now when they retire if it grows at 8% per year. What is that IRA going to be worth 15 years from now if it grows at 8% per year? Anybody have any guesses? Million? How many of you guys have heard of the rule of 72? Okay. Rule of 72 says take the rate of growth, divide it into 72. That tells you how many years till the asset doubles. We divide 8 into 72. That tells us in 9 years that 500 is worth $1 million. 6 years later, in the 15th year, it's now worth $1.6 million. Folks, I know this sounds great. But what's wrong with having $1.6 million in your tax-deferred bucket? You still got to pay taxes on it. In fact, did you know that required minimum distributions alone on $1.6 million will put you in one of the higher marginal federal tax brackets and literally guarantee that your Social Security will be taxable in perpetuity with all of the compensating spend down that goes along with it. So what we want to do is we want to prevent that IRA from ever getting to $1.6 million, which begs the question, how do you prevent an IRA from growing? And don't anyone say, put it in the stock market. Well, one of my very favorite ways is to do what we call a Roth conversion. How many guys have heard of Roth conversion? Okay, so Roth conversion simply says that if you have money in your tax-deferred bucket, you can shift it to tax-free so long as you pay what along the way? Taxes at what rate? Whatever the rate happens to be in the year you do the shift. So let's say that they converted all in 1 year. I'm not saying that you should. Let's say that they did, and they pay 40% tax. How much tax are they going to have to pay on that $500,000 Roth conversion? $200,000. Here's the problem. Do Mr. and Mrs. Jones have $200,000 just lying around that they can earmark for that tax bill? They don't have it. So some people say, Dave, that's okay. They don't need to have it. Just have the IRS withhold the tax from the Roth conversion itself. Folks, what would happen if a couple of 50-year-olds paid the tax on their Roth conversion out of the IRA itself? That's exactly right. They get a 10% penalty. The IRS says even if you take the money out and you give it right back to the IRS in the form of a tax, if you're younger than 59 and a half when you do so, they will charge you a 10% penalty. So what's the moral of the story here? Unless you got a lot of money just languishing in your taxable bucket that you would happily earmark towards a tax on that Roth conversion, I would probably wait until you're 59 and a half before you start thinking about doing one. Which begs the question, is there any other way to get money out of that IRA pre-59 and a half without penalty? Well, at this point, I may recommend that little-known section of the IRS tax code. It's section 72, subsection T. In our industry, we call it a 72T. And the 72T says that you can take money out of that IRA pre-59 and a half without penalty, so long as you do it in separate, equal yearly distributions that last for at least 5 years or until 59 and a half, whichever is longer. These days, a couple of 50-year-olds could take out about 5% per year. So if we did a 72T on that IRA, we can now shift $25,000 per year from tax-deferred to tax-free. All right, let's take a look at these mutual funds. If that's their emergency fund, how do we feel about it? Do they have too much or too little in their emergency funds? Too much. If they make $100,000 per year, how much should they have in their emergency funds? Much closer to 50, right? So not only do they have too much, but they're growing into mutual funds, which means the problem is getting bigger every year. So what we want to do is we want to take the growth on the mutual fund plus some of the principal, and we want to shift it from there to there, little by little, year by year, such that by the time they reach retirement, they got the perfect amount. I've done the math on this, folks. That would require an annual shift from there to there of $6,000 per year. All right, how do we feel about 401ks that don't have matches? Should you do them? Folks, this is one thing that Susie Orman, Dave Ramsey, and Clark Howard actually agree upon. The rule of thumb when it comes to 401ks is you put in up to the match, but not 1 penny above and beyond. You do whatever's required to get the free money, and then you move on to the next best thing. Well, if these folks are trying to prevent their IRA from growing by doing a 72T, yet they're putting money hand over fist into a 401k and they're getting no free money, are those two strategies at odds with each other? Yeah, that's a conflicted strategy. So we want to recapture that $10,000, shift it to tax-free. How do we feel about term life insurance and long-term care insurance? We feel like it's incredibly important to mitigate both risks, either one of which can really upset your financial apple cart, but we feel like sometimes there's just a better way to accomplish it. So we may free up that money as well. So how much total money did we free up on an annual basis to be able to reposition to tax-free? What does that all add up to? $47,000. Now, usually at this point, someone will say, "Hey, Dave, not so fast. You didn't really free up $47,000." And I'll say, "Why not?" And they'll say, "Because some of those recommendations that you made are actually taxable events." Are they right? Yes. That 72T is a taxable event, and when you put less money into your 401k, that increases your taxable income, so that's also a taxable event. So because of this strategy, we just realized an extra $35,000 of additional taxable income. We'll call it 30% on the margin. So because of this strategy, we just realized an extra $10,500 of taxes every single year we do this strategy. Let me ask you a question. Do Mr. and Mrs. Jones here have $10,500 just lying around that they would love to earmark for that tax bill? That they would love to earmark for that tax bill? Not that they would love. And if we say, quit going out to eat, quit going on vacation, pull back the belt a couple of notches just so you can pay that tax bill, will they return my phone calls? Probably not. So I got to find a way to help them pay that tax bill such that we are not encroaching on their lifestyle. So what I may recommend is that they simply pay that tax right out of the $47,000 that we just freed up on the previous screen, which means we really have $36,500 per year to shift to the tax-free bucket. So folks, this is where the rubber hits the road. Where can we put $36,500 per year such that it grows in a truly tax-free way? Well, at this point, I may recommend that they fully, holy smokes, this is running away from me here. I may recommend that they fully fund one of my very favorite tax-free investments, and that's what we call a Roth IRA. How many of you guys have heard of Roth IRAs? Okay. How much money can two 50-year-olds in 2024, how much money can two 50-year-olds put into Roth IRAs these days? $16,000, that's right. $8,000 each for a total of $16,000 per year. Folks, why do I like Roth IRAs so much? I like Roth IRAs so much because Roth IRAs are truly tax-free. So long as you're 59 and a half when you take the money out, you don't pay any of those taxes we talked about. And when you take money out of a Roth IRA, it does not count as provisional income. It does not count against the thresholds which cause Social Security taxation. Roth IRAs are truly tax-free. By the way, when I say Roth IRA, I'm talking any investment with the word Roth in front of it. It could be a Roth IRA, could be a Roth 401k, could be a Roth conversion. They are all truly tax-free. Okay, so we fully fund the Roth IRA at $16,000 per year, which means we now have $20,500 left. Where can we put $20,500 per year such that it grows in a truly tax-free way? Well, at this point, I may bring up a bucket of money that gets treated differently for tax purposes than anything else we've talked about so far. What happens with this bucket is you put money in. As your money grows, your bucket begins to fill. Only the IRS says that the growth on the money in this bucket is going to be treated under a different section of the IRS tax code than anything else we've talked about so far. What does that section of the IRS tax code say? It says that you can touch this money pre-59 and a half without penalty. Can you do that on your IRA or 401k? No, you cannot. They're going to tell you that as your money grows, you receive no 1099s. What does that mean? No tax as it grows. They're also going to tell you that when you take the money out, when you take it out the right way, it does not show up as reportable income on your tax return. What does that mean? That means it's tax-free and does not count as provisional income. They're also going to tell you that there are no contribution limits. What did we say were the contribution limits for the Roth IRA? $8,000 each for a total of $16,000 per year, folks. I got clients that do $50 a month, and I got clients that do $200,000 per year, and everywhere in between. There are no limits on how much you put into this bucket. They're also going to tell you that there are no income limitations. Let me ask you this. Can Bill Gates do a Roth IRA? He cannot. How come? He makes too much money. You start making north of $240,000 in modified adjusted gross income, you can no longer do a Roth IRA. Can my children, two of whom are here tonight, can my children do Roth IRAs? In order to do a Roth IRA, you have to have earned income. My kids work, I just don't pay them. That rule does not apply to this particular bucket. They're also going to tell you that if history serves as a model, there may be no legislative risk. What do you think I mean by no legislative risk? That maybe the Congress won't change the rules on us somewhere down the road? Well, guess what? Congress did change the rules on this bucket 3 different times, in 82, 84, and 88. But guess what? Every single time they changed the rules, they simply said, whoever has the bucket before the rule changes gets to keep it and continue to put money into it under the old rule for the rest of their lives. What do we call that kind of a clause? A grandfather clause. Well, usually right about now, people are saying, well, gosh, Dave, this is like the alignment of the stars. It's like the perfect bucket. Why not just put all your money into there? Well, first of all, is it ever a good idea to put all your eggs into any one basket? Of course not. Not only that, but the IRS says if we're going to give you the benefit of an unlimited bucket of tax-free dollars, we're going to require that there be a cost of admission. We're going to require that there be a spigot attached to the side of the bucket through which flows on a monthly basis some expenses. And what do those expenses go towards? They go towards some administrative fees, but they primarily go towards the cost of term life insurance. Now, let me ask you a question. If your house is paid off, your kids have moved out, you're rapidly approaching retirement, is term life insurance really all that high on your wish list? No. It's usually right about now that people start dumping their term life insurance. And the companies that sponsor these programs recognize that, so they've done something to sweeten the pot. They simply say that in the event that somewhere down the road you should need long-term care, they will give you your death benefit while you're alive for the purpose of paying for it. Here's an example. Let's say you got a death benefit of $400,000. You wake up one day, you can no longer feed yourself, bathe yourself, transfer yourself, what have you. You can find one doctor to write one letter to that effect. They will start sending you 25% of your death benefit every year for 4 years for the purpose of paying for long-term care. So that's $100,000 per year, every year for 4 years. Now, they may discount that number slightly based on the age in which you received the benefit, but the point is this. They're willing to give you your death benefit while you're alive for the purpose of paying for long-term care. Let me ask you a question. How many of you guys have looked into traditional long-term care insurance? Is it cheap? No, it's getting more and more expensive all the time. Can it be hard to qualify? Yes. You might live to be 120, but if you have a bad back, a bad hip, a bad knee, you may not even get accepted. And what happens if you pay for 30 years and die peaceful in your sleep, never having used it? Do they send you all your money back at the end? No. It goes to pay for someone else's long-term care. And that can be a source of heartburn for a lot of different people because nobody wants to pay for something they hope they never have to use. Why is this different? This is different because if you die peaceful in your sleep 30 years from now, never having needed long-term care, guess what? Someone's still getting a death benefit. Probably your kids or your grandkids. So there isn't that sensation of having paid for something you hope you never have to use. By the way, have Mr. and Mrs. Jones here already bought off on the idea that they need long-term care? They need term insurance and long-term care insurance? Yes. They're already paying for it. They're already budgeted for it. All we're suggesting is that maybe, instead of sending that money off to an insurance company in the form of a premium payment, why not dump it into their bucket? Let just a portion of it drip out in the form of expenses and now take advantage of a huge bucket of tax-free dollars that wasn't previously available to them. By the way, what do we call this bucket? This is chapter 5 of my book. We call it the LIRP. What does that stand for? Life Insurance Retirement Plan. Why life insurance? Because the IRS says in order for this bucket to work, you got to be willing to pay for some life insurance. You got to have a need for life insurance. Why retirement plan? Because one of the ancillary goals of this bucket is to build money up so that somewhere down the road you can take money out and spend it on your lifestyle at a period in time when tax rates are likely to be dramatically higher than they are today. Okay, before we go any further, I've got a very important question to ask, and it's simply this. If you could be in any tax bracket of your choosing in retirement, which tax bracket would you choose? 0. Well, if what Mr. and Mrs. Jones want is to be in the 0% tax bracket, tell me how we're doing so far. They're going to have money coming out of their Roth IRA. So long as they're 59.5 when they take that money out, will they pay tax? No tax. They're going to have a lot of money coming out of their LIRP, regardless of how old they are when they take that money out. Will they pay tax? No. Now, let's go back to that IRA. You guys remember that IRA? The goal of doing the 72T was what? To prevent the $500,000 from getting any bigger. If we did a good job of preventing that IRA from getting any bigger, how much money should still be in that IRA by the time they reach 65? $500,000. So here's my question for you. If at age 65, sorry, I got ahead of myself. If at age 65, they have $500,000 in their IRA, is there any way that they can take money out, spend it on their lifestyle, not pay tax, and it's got to be legal? What do you think? Remember, by the time you reach retirement, all of the deductions that you experienced during your working years have vanished into thin air. Your house is paid off, your kids have moved out, you're no longer contributing to that 401k. So the IRS says, hey, in our infinite goodness, absent any of those deductions, we will give you a deduction. What do we call that deduction? We call that a standard deduction, which if you retire today as a married couple is $29,200. What does that mean? That means that you can realize income from any number of sources up to $29,200 without paying any tax at all. Does the IRS index that number to keep up with inflation? Historically, they have by 3% per year. So by the time Mr. and Mrs. Jones reach 65, their standard deduction is going to be much closer to $44,450, which begs the question, if at age 65 they have a standard deduction of $44,450, how much could they take out of that IRA without paying any tax at all? $44,450. What's the moral of the story? So long as you only take out up to whatever your standard deduction happens to be in any given year, you now have an IRA that's 100% tax-free. And if you have no tax, no tax, no tax, and you can stay below your provisional income threshold, what do you suppose happens to your Social Security? No tax. And if you have no tax, no tax, no tax, no tax, what tax bracket does that put you in? 0%. Now, folks, why do I make such a big deal about being in the 0% tax bracket? Well, if we can't get you to the 0% tax bracket, what's the next best tax bracket? And don't anyone say 1. It goes all the way up to 10. Throw in another 6% for state, now we're talking 16. And if what David Walker says comes true and tax rates have to double to keep our country solvent, what happens to 16? 32. All of a sudden, second place isn't looking all that great. Now, I love it when things make sense conceptually, but I love it even more when things make sense mathematically. So what I did for Mr. and Mrs. Jones is I did what's called a before and after comparison. I simply said, if Mr. and Mrs. Jones had never met me, and they kept on doing exactly what they were doing, and they didn't change a thing, and tax rates happened to stay at about 30% effective for the rest of their lives, how much money would they be able to spend after tax? And according to my math, they'd be able to spend just shy of $4.4 million. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. The problem is they run out of money at age 85, at which point they can either die or move in with their kids. And most people would rather die. That seemed especially strong at this table right here. Okay, so conversely, if they do everything we talked about tonight, we give them the 0% tax bracket, get their Social Security tax-free, they now can spend almost $8 million. They never run out of money. They still have $1.4 million left over at the end. Now, people look at this difference. They say, Dave, how could that be? That's such a massive difference. And you know what I tell them? I say, when you make little, tiny, strategic changes midway through your life, and you amortize the benefit of those changes out over the balance of your life, there can be a massive quantum difference on the back end. More importantly, what happens to the column on the left if tax rates double? Does it get bigger or smaller? It gets smaller. What happens to the column on the right if tax rates double? It stays exactly the same. Why? Because if you're in the 0% tax bracket and tax rates double, 2 times 0 is still 0. Folks, that is what we call the power of 0. Now, usually at this point we get a couple of different questions, but I have to tell you, far and away, there's one question that gets asked more than any others. Second place isn't even really all that close. The number one question that I get is, Dave, am I too old to get to the 0% tax bracket? That's the number one question. And I usually respond to that question the following way. Throughout 2018, filmmaker Doug Orchard and I crisscrossed the country, interviewing all of the most important experts in the nation on the national debt as it relates to the future of tax rates. Take a listen to what they had to say.
The truth is the federal government has lost control of the budget.
Instead of paying for all the new initiatives, whether they're tax cuts, spending increases, all sorts of things that we like, the government's just putting it all on the national credit card. And as a result, our national debt is just going up and up and up. And it's growing faster than the economy, and that's when you know you have a real problem.
Everything is going to be squeezed out of the budget. There won't be anything left.
The road we're on is a perilous one that ultimately leads to the bankrupting of our country.
So we have a crisis on our hands.
All Congress has to do for this whole situation to come to a head is nothing. Because every year that they do nothing makes the problem even more unsolvable.
We don't seem to have the ability to get along and find common ground.
Is the government trying to trick you right now? And the answer is very simply yes.
So why is this being swept under the rug? Why is nobody talking about this?
Probably because it's not popular.
So I've actually been traveling around the country for about 4 years now, taking the Power of Zero message to different groups.
When you cut taxes
on current generations, you are simultaneously raising them on future generations.
It is all driven by spending. Once we have spent a dollar, we've already decided to tax it. The only question is whether we tax it now or we borrow it now and tax it in the future.
So to make up for the liabilities that we're incurring with all the promises we've made in social insurance programs, we're going to have to increase substantially the tax rate and perhaps even double it.
Now, precisely how high it's going to be, there's a lot of room to debate, but people will have to pay more taxes.
People's retirement savings are at risk of future higher taxes.
Well, qualified plans really do two things. They defer the tax and the tax calculation. Now let that run past your brain real slow.
I'm driven by trying to help as many people as I can avoid this disaster that's going to come up in retirement when taxes go up and the market goes down. What are these people going to do if they haven't planned ahead of time?
Okay, so all these experts are reading the same music and they're singing the same song. They're simply saying that if we don't change course as a country, that 10 years from now, taxes will have to rise dramatically or we go broke as a nation. Some of them even use the D word as it relates to the future of tax rates. Tax rates will have to double or we go broke as a nation. So the real question in my mind is not, are you too old to get to the 0% tax bracket? The real question should be, should 2030 roll around and tax rates double, will you look back on the year 2024 and say, why did I not take advantage of tax rates while they were historically low? Because all tax rates have to do in the future is go up by 1% for the math here to make sense. The second question I get is, hey, can I be in the 0% tax bracket and still be a good person? After all, if we're all in the 0% tax bracket, who's going to pay for the roads? Who's going to pay for the schools? Who's going to pay for the social programs? Well, first of all, are we suggesting that Mr. and Mrs. Jones here not pay tax? No. The cost of getting to the 0% tax bracket is you got to be willing to pay a tax. I'm simply suggesting that when given the choice between paying taxes at today's historically low tax rates or postponing the payment of those taxes till some point much further down the road, that you're probably better off paying them today. And the last question I get is, hey, Dave, how come I've never heard of this stuff before? And I would submit that you guys have heard of just about everything we've talked about here tonight. Maybe not quite in this combination, but you guys have heard of just about everything we've talked about. The only thing that's new for some people is this idea of the LIRP, and all we're doing with the LIRP is the opposite of what most people do when it comes to life insurance. What do most people do when it comes to life insurance? They get as much death benefit as they possibly can for as little money as possible. What do we call that kind of life insurance? Term insurance. Here we're doing just the opposite. We're getting as little death benefit as the IRS requires of us, and we're stuffing as much money into it as the IRS allows in an attempt to mimic all of the tax-free benefits of the Roth IRA without any of the limitations. Why else haven't you heard about this? Well, you got to ask yourself how most major money management institutions make money. How do most major money management institutions make money? They charge you they charge you a fee. What's a typical fee? Call 1% because it's already up on my screen. So let's say they've got $1 million in your tax-deferred bucket. They're charging you 1% per year. How much are they making off you per year? $10,000. No big deal. That's how a lot of financial advisors get paid. But here's the rub. If they were to persuade you that tax rates in the future are likely to be dramatically higher than they are today, you might just feel impressed to shift that money to tax-free. And if you shift it to tax-free, what are you going to have to pay along the way? Taxes, let's call it 30%. So you pay 30% tax, now you got $700,000 in your tax-free bucket. If they're still charging you 1%, now they're only making $7,000 per year off you. Didn't they just experience a pay cut for persuading you that tax rates in the future are likely to be dramatically higher than they are today? And for that reason alone, most major money management institutions don't want to touch this conversation with a 10-foot pole. Me personally, I don't care how much money you have. The only thing that matters to me is how much you actually get to spend after tax. That is the only number that really matters. Okay, so for those of you who are taking notes, I got 5 takeaways for you. Takeaway number 1. Tax rates in the future are likely to be dramatically higher than they are today. Mathematically speaking, we have already passed the point of no return. Takeaway number 2. The only way to truly insulate yourself from the impact of higher taxes is to get to the 0% tax bracket. Why? Because if you're in the 0% tax bracket and tax rates double, 2 times 0 is still 0. Takeaway number 3, I've been doing this for over 25 years, 27 years to be exact. I've helped put thousands of Americans on the road to the 0% tax bracket, and I've noticed something very interesting along the way. It is nearly impossible to get to the 0% tax bracket by utilizing just one stream of income. You can't get there simply by contributing to a Roth IRA. You can't get there by simply owning an LIRP. To get to the 0% tax bracket typically takes between 4 and 6 different streams of tax-free income, none of which show up on the IRS's radar, but all of which contribute to you being in the 0% tax bracket. Tonight, we talked about 4 of those streams of tax-free income. Takeaway number 4. We know that as of January 1st, 2018, that tax rates are on sale. But we also know that that tax sale has an expiration date, right? January 1st, 2026. What does that mean? That means that every year between now and 2026 represents a little mini window of opportunity within which to take advantage of historically low tax rates. And every year that goes by where you fail to take advantage of historically low tax rates is potentially a year beyond 2026 when you could pay some of the highest tax rates you're likely to see in your lifetime. And the last takeaway is simply this: believe it or not, all of this is really, really good news for you. Let me illustrate with a quick story. Not long ago, a lady came up to me at the end of my presentation. She said, hey Dave, thanks a lot. Now I'm in a really bad mood. I said, well, why are you in such a bad mood? She says, because I got all my money in the tax-deferred bucket. I said, let me see if I understand this correctly. You contributed to the tax-deferred bucket at a period in your life when tax rates were much higher than they are today. You got a tax deduction of those higher rates for doing so. You now have a 2-year period of time during which to take advantage of historically low tax rates, so that by the time tax rates potentially double over time, you've done all the heavy lifting, you can then take that money out tax-free. I said, is that why you're in such a bad mood? She says, well, gosh, Dave, I never really thought about it that way. So my question is, how is this story going to end for you? Well, I would submit that so long as you take advantage of this next period of historically low tax rates, that you get to determine how much of your hard-earned retirement savings that you get to spend. Now, before I give up the mic, I want to brag on my friend Scott Nelson a little bit. Scott gave a great introduction in terms of how we met, and he's been a part of our program for several years now, and I have to tell you that Scott is among the very best in the state of Utah at this type of planning, if not the nation. He's really shined in our program and really mastered the ability to shepherd clients through this entire process. What Scott is willing to do for each of you is what we call that before and after comparison. Only the comparison that he does for you is going to be a little bit different. There's going to be 3 different projections. The first projection says simply this: if you keep on doing exactly what you're doing and you don't change a thing and tax rates stay about where they are today, how much money will you be able to spend after tax? When will your money run out? He will show you the year in which your money runs out. He will then run a second comparison that says, if you keep on doing exactly what you're doing, you don't change a thing, and tax rates double, how much sooner will you run out of money? And plot spoiler here, it's about 12 to 15 years faster. He will then run a third comparison that says, if you implement all of the recommendations that he suggests that you implement — by the way, he works very closely with our office. In fact, we have one of our team members right here, Taylor, he actually lives in Brigham City, works very, very closely with our office to come up with those recommendations. If you were to implement all of those recommendations, get at or near the 0% tax bracket, how much longer would your money last? And guess what? If your money lasts 5 to 7 years longer and you spend an extra $1.5 million along the way, I think at that point it's probably worth looking into. Other than that, you guys have been really super terrific. I'm happy to stick around afterwards to sign books, whatever, answer questions, what have you. But you guys have been really, really great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, David. I always love listening to him. He does such a great job. So as David mentioned, we are offering free strategy sessions. I mean, obviously there's a big crowd here, and granted, some of you have already done this. But for those of you who feel like you would like to take advantage of a free strategy session, I would invite you now to go out to the table that's in the entry and see Julie or Elise. There's cards there with dates and times that are available. Pick one that fits your schedule and just fill your information in on the back there, and they'll get you on our calendar so you can do that. So if you just know, hey, I'd really like to take advantage of that, we'd invite you to do that right now. and go see Julie DeLeese, and they'll get you going. Fair? Okay. So for those of you that know, yep, that's what we want to do, fill that out and off you go. Meanwhile, David has been gracious enough to agree to do some Q&A here with us. So again, if you'd like to get a strategy session, go ahead and snag that. You'll be able to hear the questions and answers.
What questions do you have? What questions did this presentation provoke? Yes, in the middle there. The other two strategies that we talked about, or that make up the 6 that we didn't really go into, one was the Roth 401k, and the other was the Roth conversion. So if I were to list them all, it would be Roth conversion, Roth 401k, Roth IRA, LIRP, taking money out of your IRA, offset by the standard deduction. What am I missing? Social Security, if you stay below the provisional income thresholds, then your Social Security is also tax-free. So those are your 6. And I talk about all of those in the book, so if you want a primer, you can go back and review that. How do you pull your money out of a LIRP? There's 2 ways to do it. The first way is by way of simply withdrawing your money. So you put money in, those are after-tax dollars. You have every right to pull those dollars out tax-free. The other way, if you want to pull your growth out, you do that by way of a guaranteed 0% loan. I talk about that in the book. Basically, they charge you an interest rate on the one hand, but they credit it right back to you, so it's as if it feels from a tax perspective like a tax-free distribution from your Roth IRA. It has the same net effect on your tax return. There's a whole section in the book on that. Other questions? We still got 8 minutes left. Yes, right here. The one thing I am certain of is that legislation will change in the future to mess some of this stuff up. But I'm also confident that whatever you implement today is likely to be grandfathered. So there is a narrowing window of opportunity here within which to take advantage of not just historically low tax rates, but some of these. Let me tell you, as the country slowly goes into bankruptcy, they're going to be looking in all quarters for new sources of revenue. But the one thing that we do know is that historically they have grandfathered. They're not likely to take money that's already been taxed in your Roth IRA and then tax it again. Not likely to happen. Yes? Well, I would probably begin with Scott. If you have questions about the LIRP or you want to implement one, sign up for an appointment with Scott. He's, like I said, he's very well versed in all 6 of those strategies, not just the LIRP, but all 6 of those strategies. So Scott would be a great place to start. Yes, right here, Christopher. So the question is, how do we keep up with inflation? Okay. The LIRP is very interest rate sensitive. The one thing we know is that as inflation goes up, what happens to interest rates? Tends to go up as well to try to combat it. So as inflation goes up, that makes the LIRP a particularly valuable tool in your tool belt to be able to combat inflation. Other questions? Yes, in the back. Yes. That's a great question. In fact, I wrote an entire chapter in the book, The Power of Zero. I believe it's now chapter 8. It says pensions in the 0% tax bracket. I'm sad to report that you will never get to the 0% tax bracket, but I'm happy to report that there are things that you can do to sort of tamp down your tax burden over time. So you worry about the things that you can control. You don't worry about the things you can't control. You can't control the pension, but there's lots of other things you can control, and those are the things that I talk about. Great question. Other questions?
On the LIRP, does it increase your premium the more you put in?
Does it increase the premium the more you put in? No, there's a finite amount of money you can put in, and that's linked to your death benefit, and these are all governed by IRS tables. So generally speaking, once you begin your LIRP, the death benefit tells you how big your bucket is, and the size of your bucket tells you how much money you can put in. And that tends to be a finite. There's no limit on how much you can grow, but there is a limit on how much you can put in, and that's governed by the death benefit. And there's a section in the book that talks about that as well. Yes, right here.
So I guess I didn't see the correlation, but when you take Social Security out, how it is less. I didn't see how.
When you take Social Security, how it can be taxed? Okay, so when you have what's called provisional income, okay, the IRS tracks provisional income, and that's the income that the IRS tracks to determine if your Social Security is going to be taxed. What counts as provisional income? Any 1099s coming out of your taxable bucket count as provisional income. Any distributions at all from your tax-deferred bucket count as provisional income. And 1/2 of your Social Security counts as provisional income. So the IRS adds it all up. If it's a married person, it adds up to more than $44,000, then up to 85% of your Social Security will become taxable to you at your highest marginal tax bracket. So that's a big deal, because if you have a hole in your Social Security, you got to plug it somehow, and most people have to take even more money out of their IRAs and 401ks to plug the hole in their Social Security. So it's a sort of a domino effect where it forces you to spend down your other assets that much faster. So that's why, if there's any way at all that you could get your Social Security tax-free, then your money's just going to last longer. Great question. Yes, right here.
Is it LIRP? Is it the same thing as whole life?
No. Okay, this is what I would tell you. All LIRPs are life insurance policies at their core, right? But not all life insurance policies are LIRPs. So I would not classify whole life as an LIRP, because it has a number of deficiencies when it comes to qualifying for an LIRP. So I talk about that as well in the book. Other questions? Yes, please.
So this 44,000, whatever, what is included?
Lots of things are included in your $44,000 provisional income threshold. I only listed a few tonight. Any 1099s coming out of your taxable bucket, any distributions at all from your 401k or IRA, any money you earn, any interest off your municipal bonds, rental income, all of these things can count as provisional income. Pretty much whatever goes into your modified adjusted gross income counts. 1/2 of your Social Security counts. So it's pretty easy to get up to that $44,000 threshold, particularly if you have a lot of money coming out of your IRAs and 401ks. RMDs alone could push you above that $44,000 threshold if you let that tax-deferred bucket get too big. Yes, ma'am. How do I make my fees? I have a network of advisors across the country. I have 250 Power of Zero advisors that have been trained, vetted, qualified personally by me. So I work with them. When they help people get to the 0% tax bracket, the companies that they use to help you, they pay them directly, and I'm sort of part of that. The other way is, I do speaking events all across the country. I sell a lot of books, so don't worry about me, I'll be okay. Yes, sir.
So that 44,000 then basically would be your adjusted gross income. It captures everything.
Not really, because they're including as part of that formula 1/2 of your Social Security. So it's kind of like it's more like your modified adjusted gross income plus 1/2 of your Social Security. So it's very, very easy to get up to 44,000. I've got some videos on my YouTube channel that go into that, by the way. I do have a YouTube channel. I put out 3 videos per week. Okay. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you guys. I've got a book coming out in the fall. If you want to be super, super nice to me, you could go home and pre-order a copy tonight. But my next book is called The Guru Gap: How America's Financial Gurus Are Leading You Astray and How to Get Back on Track. Okay? Probably some Dave Ramsey fans in the audience. I take direct aim at some things that Dave Ramsey said, Susie Orman, Clark Howard, Ramit Sethi, even Ken Fisher. So this is for those of you who want to know the other side of what all of those guys are telling you and some real deficiencies in the retirement advice that they're sort of putting out into the public domain. This book talks about all of those deficiencies that they talk about. So if you want to pre-order a copy, you can do that as well. It's called The Guru Gap. Question? Today is always the best day. Right? Today is always the best day. And I would tell you that the farther out into the future your retirement horizon, the more you should be investing in tax-free investments. Because the national debt's going to be $54 trillion by 2034. And then once we hit 2034, it starts going up by $3 trillion per year. So guess what? As tax rates, as the national debt starts to grow and compound over time, what happens to the likelihood that tax rates will continue to rise? It starts to shoot through the roof. So if you know young people, give them a copy of The Power of Zero, because there's some real urgency here in terms of not just saving starting now, but saving in the right types of accounts. The question is, where do annuities fall? Annuities can be either in your tax-deferred bucket or your tax-free bucket. So an annuity is just a way to generate your own personal pension, just like you might get through work. So annuities, it's the same concept. If you don't like annuities, you're not going to like the pension you get through your job, and you're certainly not going to like Social Security, because they all operate according to this exact same concept. So, other questions while you have me? All right. Well, once again, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Dave. So for those of you who have one of Dave's books with you, he's agreed to stick around as long as needed to autograph those, chat with you. Do you want him to just come here to your table? So come on up. But again, thank you so much for being here. Again, if you'd like to schedule a free strategy session, see Julie or Elise. Be happy to visit with you and look at your situation, specifically in the context of the concepts that Dave presented tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
If you found this information useful, please share it. If there is something you hear that raises a question, you can sign up for our free consultation as well as sign up for our free newsletter. Visit AskScottNelson.com to sign up. Thanks for listening. Remember, if you plan well, you can retire happy.
The information provided is for educational purposes only and is not intended as investment advice for anyone. All information discussed is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. The views presented today are those of SLN Financial Incorporated and do not necessarily represent the views of Alpha Star Capital Management, LLC. The opinions expressed are subject to change without notice and do not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice. Please consult your financial professional before executing any financial strategy. Investment advisory and financial planning services are offered through Alpha Star Capital Management, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Alpha Star and SLN Financial Incorporated are independent entities.